Good evening. Welcome to Mental Health, Wellness, and Recovery. My name is Richard Weingarten, and I'll be your host for tonight's show. On tonight's show, which is titled Making Lemonade Out of Lemons, I'm going to talk about some of my mental health struggles and how I overcame them, and how I used my experiences of illness and recovery to work in the mental health field. On my program tonight is Joan Lane, who's the project manager of the Southwest Community Health Center in Bridgeport. Welcome to the show, Joan.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for inviting me. Pleased to be here.
It's nice to have you here, and could you tell us a little about your work in Bridgeport and the surrounding communities?
Sure. Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about the organization. Southwest Community Health Center is a federally qualified health center program. It serves largely inner city people in Bridgeport and surrounding communities, and about 26,000 patients at any given time. And we have medical services, dental services, behavioral health services. So there's a linkage between what you do and what I do. My own background is in public health, which is looking at population health rather than the individual. So we diverge a little bit in that way. But just a quick comment, because you and I have talked about this. I think where these come together is, I think about the COVID pandemic.
Yes.
And the fact that, of course, there was great devastation on the medical side, people becoming ill, people dying, but the toll that took on people's mental health was huge.
Yes.
And, loneliness, grief, depression, just anxiety, stress.
Yes.
And really, I think it brought a lot more people to recognize the need for mental health services.
Yes, that's right, yes.
But something that you and I have talked about is the stigma attached to people seeking.
People are reluctant to go for services, aren't they, when they become ill?
I think so, yeah. Less so on the medical health side, the physical health side, and more on the mental health side. Why do you think that is? Why is it a stigma?
I think it's because mental illness is an invisible illness. And it's not like a broken arm or broken leg. You can't see it. So people feel somewhat responsible for their illness. They feel guilt and some shame that they can't think right, or they can't concentrate anymore, or they're having some pain in their body that they don't know where it comes from or why it's there. And so people are reluctant, and they think that it's because it's up to them, they can get better themselves.
Yeah, having a feeling of responsibility. And I think also part of what I think causes the stigma is that it's frightening to other people, seeing behavior that doesn't feel normal. It makes people nervous, and so I think the person who's suffering from the emotional difficulties wants to hide it and tries to keep it under wraps rather than addressing it.
That's right. And there are different things that sort of like disinformation that people think about people with mental illness. They think that people are violent, or that they're unpredictable, or that they are incompetent to do things, And so a lot of times people internalize that social stigma onto themselves, which makes it very, very difficult for them to accept what they have and go for treatment.
Well, so let's segue to, we're going to talk about your personal experience, and I don't know if you experienced that kind of stigma and anxiety at the front end of seeking help.
I definitely
talk
did.
about
that.
That.
Yes. Well, I remember once being in a hospital in California, a mental hospital, and a woman that I was dating came to visit me, and she was very nervous being in a mental hospital, so I suggested we go out to the parking lot and talk there. We were in the parking lot, and I said, well, I'm getting out of the hospital on Tuesday. I'll call you when I get home. She looked at me and she says, I never want to see you again. She says, you have no future. And with that, she turns and walked away, and I never heard from her again.
So exactly what you needed was support, and you got exactly the opposite.
Rejection, yeah. And I know that was true of a lot of people with mental health issues. My parents, for example, didn't acknowledge my illness. My father thought that I needed a good job, and once I had a good job, all my problems would go away.
Snap out of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
My problem started when I was 28 in the mid-70s, when I left a graduate program in Texas in Latin American Studies, and I also had a breakup with my long-term Brazilian girlfriend. And when I moved to Boston, I was very depressed, extremely depressed. And fortunately, I was able to go to therapy. And I mentioned this to you in an earlier contact, that I had a friend in the Peace Corps who I could talk about my problems with, and he would understand them and acknowledge them for me. So I already had the experience of somebody giving me their understanding and empathy, and so I went immediately into therapy, which helped a lot.
So you were lucky you didn't feel that kind of barrier to seeking help, basically.
That's right. I was very fortunate in that sense, and my therapist helped me a lot. When I went in to see him, I was usually very depressed, and when I left his room, I felt okay, and I felt one day I'm going to be feeling okay again and lead an active life like I had in Brazil.
So, that's a huge component, I think, just having a sense of hope.
Yes, for me it was very important.
Belief that you can get to the other side of something.
Yes, and therapy helped too, because I had these issues with my father and we didn't get along. And with my therapist, I understood my father as the complex man he was, and I worked through the issues I had with him and reconciled with him. Another thing that therapist did for me was that my father wanted me to come back to Ohio to go into his business with him. And he and I didn't get along. I didn't want to do that, but the therapist helped me take a stand to work for a life of my own choosing, which was very important to me.
I'm going to interject a little bit about my own experience here. I've never been derailed by mental health issues, but at a similarly young age, I needed help. I was and then sort of late 20s stage of life and trying to figure out, what am I going to do? What's my purpose? And like you, I was comfortable seeking some support, and it was very helpful to me.
Because of the social stigma, I isolated myself. I didn't want to meet my friends because I felt like I couldn't hold up my end of the conversation. So I worked as a part-time instructor in a Portuguese bilingual program at Cambridge Ringe Latin High School, and I taught the classes. Then I came home and I stayed home and I didn't venture out. It took me a long time to venture out and to lead a more normal life again. I can tell you a little bit about it if you'd like to hear about how I started my recovery.
Yes, I think that's a big part of what we want to talk about, is sort of how you got on.
I was very fortunate because I'd gone to California to do a master's program in human development, and I had a very difficult time out there. I was hospitalized a few times after psychotic episodes. And I went to Cleveland not knowing what I wanted to do or what I could do, and I had been misdiagnosed in California and put on the wrong medication, and my head was in a cloud a lot of the times. The doctor in Boston who I talked to about this said I should get off the medication. So I got off the medication cold turkey. You're not supposed to do that because it's very powerful. I wound up in the hospital within 48 hours. And in the hospital, they took me off the medication I was on gradually and put me on another medication that was more helpful, that allowed me to have a clear mind. So I'm out of the hospital, and I see a person with lived experience on the TV talking about his work organizing self-help groups among people with lived experience in Cleveland. And I met with him. He took me to a agency that had a peer support, a self-help group that was working on a discharge handbook for patients coming out of the psychiatric hospital in Cleveland. And I joined that group, and one of the staff people from the agency invited me to work at the agency on the project when I felt like it, when I wasn't depressed. And so I'd go to, she gave me a desk, a typewriter, a phone, and clerical support. And then she said, come and work when you can. There's no schedule that you have to meet.
So my observation is she gave you many different kinds of resources. Some of them were concrete, but maybe the most important one was understanding.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And she let me decide when I wanted to do it. So I'd go into work an hour, 2 hours a day, and she would come past my desk and say, is there anything I can do for you? Or do you need any help? And then at lunchtime, she or one of her staff would invite me out to lunch with them. I still didn't feel confident enough to go out to lunch with them, but they'd bring me back stuff from lunch for me to eat there. They were wonderful, and gave me so much support and so much affection that I really enjoyed it. during the 8 months that I worked on the handbook at this agency, my life started to go together again. I joined a peer support group that was very interesting for people with depression and bipolar illness. And I never saw people talk openly about their illnesses before, about their problems, their troubles, their hopes and dreams, you know. And people with similar experiences would then come in with their hopes and dreams and their struggles and their victories about different things. You know?
I was going to say, so I assume that you saw some people who were well along the road to recovery, were out there accomplishing things, which it sounds like you were, but you were still kind of at the front end of gaining confidence about that.
Working on the handbook gave me a sense of being productive again, and I was using my skills as a journalist. One thing I did was I joined a spiritual community, the Unitarian Society of Cleveland. And I went there and I met the woman who was the head of the worship committee, and they had a program to invite people with mental illnesses into their congregation. And this woman, June Wortman, invited me to tell my story of illness and recovery to the congregation, along with two other
Were you
fellows.
comfortable doing that?
I wasn't. I was scared to death because I thought I was going to be rejected by everybody, you know. So I told my story, and I'm kind of anxious, you know, waiting for the reaction to the audience. And the audience lines up in 2 rows down the center aisle of the church, and one by one they came up, shook my hand, and said, "Thank you for sharing your story."
So you thought they were going to throw tomatoes, and instead they welcomed you.
Exactly. So I felt welcomed, and I felt appreciated, and I made new friends there. And they had a social action committee that was helping people from Central America who were being persecuted politically go to Canada, and I worked with them for a few weeks, and it gave me something positive to do. I felt good about that also. And then, let's see, and then I decided I needed to find work because I was thinking clearly. I was sort of back on my feet again. So I started working as a community mental health worker for a social service agency in Cleveland. And I liked that. I liked working with the peers. They were fun to work with. If they liked you, they told you that you were helping them, they wanted to continue working with you. I started a current events group with one group. I started a physical fitness group with another group of peers, and really enjoyed it. But then I decided I could do more than that, so I wanted to go back to writing again. So I got a job as a staff writer on the Cleveland Jewish News, which is a suburban weekly, and I worked with them for about a year. But then I didn't like that either, so I decided maybe I should teach Portuguese in one of the colleges. As I did a survey of greater that northeastern Ohio, there weren't any Portuguese classes offered. So I went to John Carroll University, which was a Jesuit university in Cleveland, and I offered to teach Portuguese. And the woman who was the head of their adult education program said, "If you can find 10 students, we'll offer the class." So I put notices in the bookstores and in coffee houses, and I got 17 people interested in studying Portuguese with me. I did that for a year, and then at the end of the year, they invited me to teach Brazilian culture and Portuguese to the undergraduates, and I did that for a year.
You know, I don't think you mentioned that all of this about Brazil and Portugal, the Portuguese is because you had been in the Peace Corps there.
That's correct. Yeah, I didn't mention that, but yeah, I'd been in Brazil in the Peace Corps for 3 years. I loved Brazilian culture. Then I worked as a foreign news correspondent for UPI in their bureau in Rio de Janeiro for a year and a half. So I really had a really strong connection to Brazil. I spoke Portuguese fluently. I had friends in Brazil. It was a really good experience for me.
So I see all these pieces kind of coming together and coalescing into something that, you know, is becoming your life's work, really.
Yeah, I thought I had something to give in the mental health field. And I conducted a job search for 2 years, and I wound up with a job in New Haven, Connecticut, working for the Connecticut Mental Health Center.
And here you remain.
And here I remained. I was there for 10 years. I became the Director of Consumer Initiatives and Education. And what I did, Joan, was I started programs and services that were based on things that worked for me in my illness and recovery. For example, I knew that being alone at night was sort of not such a great thing. I got scared at night, got anxious, I felt lonely, you know. And so there was a program in Connecticut called the Warm Line, which was a chat line in the evenings where people could call an 800 number and talk to a friendly voice for 10 or 15 minutes, just to kind of get over the fear and the anxiety, you know. We received over 300 calls a month in that Warm Line. And then I started another program called the Welcome Basket.
based
on the Welcome Wagon program.
Yeah.
You know, Welcome
We know
Wagon
that-
program, as you
yep,
know.
new to the neighborhood.
Exactly.
Yep, so you're kind of new to the issue. In a way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I knew that it was difficult for people because I had difficulty adjusting to community living after the hospital. In the hospital, everything is done for you. They give you your meals, your medications, your activities, social life, everything's done for you. You get out of the hospital, you're by yourself in your apartment, you have to do everything for yourself.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to make that adjustment. It was for me, so I knew it was going to be difficult for other people. In fact, it was so difficult that there was a name for it. They called it the revolving door patient. People that went home couldn't handle being by themselves in the community, so went right back to the hospital, back and forth. It costs the Connecticut Mental Health Center thousands of dollars every month for this.
Yeah.
And what we did was we put together a basket of goodies when people were discharged from the hospital, of food and plants and toiletry articles. We took it to their home and we introduced ourselves, and we were there to help them get going again in the community. So we helped them cook, helped them shop, took them out for breakfast or lunch. We set them up with mental health appointments, took them to peer support groups until they were kind of up and running again in the community. Then we move on to the next person. That program was started in 1995 by the Community Support Program, which is a national mental health program. And then after we proved its success, then DEMAS, the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, offered to pay for it in New Haven and other cities around Connecticut. That program has actually been replicated in Canada too, in Toronto.
Wow, a big success.
It started in '95, it's still going on in New Haven.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know, this makes me think of something we talked about before, maybe good to segue to. You've talked about the importance of some of the day-to-day structures that you put into your life that are, important for just sustaining your well-being.
Yes. I have a formula for staying well, for functioning well each day. I get enough sleep every night. I need 8 hours of sleep.
That's huge.
Three nutritious meals a day. I eat only good food. I get exercise almost every day. I have a social support network. I have a spiritual community that I already talked about. And I do meaningful work, or something meaningful every day to bide my time, working in Brazil. I'm going to talk about the programs in Brazil, but programs in the States. Sometimes I do reading or writing. I published many articles about my illness and recovery. I think I have more than 40 articles published in mental health journals around the world now.
Wow.
And in Brazil, which I'll talk about next, I published 2 books in Portuguese with my Brazilian colleagues down there. So Brazil was a big deal for me. And so in the late 90s, I started going to Brazil just to kind of meet people and to see how their mental health system worked, And I made a lot of friends down there. They were glad to receive me because I spoke Portuguese and I knew Brazil, and the Brazilians are very welcoming to foreigners. They even have a name for it. They call it acolhimento, which means a warm embrace of new people. And so one of the people down there, Dr. Eduardo Vasconcelos, was very involved in a national movement to close the long-term mental hospitals and open up community services. This was a program started in the late 80s among people with lived experience, their families, and the professionals.
And I think that happened here too. I don't know the timing of it, but a lot of big institutions closing because they were horrible places.
They were horrible places, like warehouses that people just were
You
treated
just
terribly.
put
They
them
were
there
thrown
and
in
that
there
was
and
the
just
end.
forget about them,
Yeah.
Brazil, that was the case too. And so Eduardo knew about the consumer movement in the United States, which was a movement that started new services and programs, started to have publications by peers of their illness and recovery, and they started conferences, regional and national conference. He wanted me to write a history of that movement so that it could catch on in Brazil too, which I did. I wrote a history of it, and I included sections on empowerment and peer support and recovery, and it was very well received among Brazilians all over Brazil when we published it. Also, because I knew a lot of peers in Brazil that were making progress in their recovery, people going back to school, getting jobs, marrying people, having a life again.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And then in 2001, I approached 2 organizations to help me gather interviews of Brazilians that had a lived experience of illness and recovery that we could publish in a book. And so I went down there in 2003 twice, including a national conference where I met peers from all over Brazil. They're doing well. So I interviewed them, and in 2006, Dr. Eduardo and myself and some of his colleagues, we published 17 in-depth interviews of people in Brazil that had an illness and recovery. And Brazil at that time didn't have a sense of recovery. That wasn't an issue. That wasn't a concept in their national program. But the book was very successful. It went through 2 editions, and then it was taught at colleges and universities all over Brazil.
Wow.
So that was really kind of neat. And then jumping ahead to 2014, I was at a conference in Brazil where they were saying they didn't know enough about recovery. They wanted more experience of recovery. So I saw that as a personal mission, went back to the States, and I had already worked with a NAMI program called In Our Own Voice.
You should say what NAMI is.
NAMI is the National Alliance of People with Mental Illness. It's the family organization, although now consumers or peers are also part of it. They had a program that I attended in a national conference called In Our Own Voice, where 2 people told their stories of their illness and recovery in 5 segments. And I was so impressed with that program that I brought it to Connecticut, and I helped prepare 15 people to tell their stories here in Connecticut. And in 2003, I believe it was, we did over 100 presentations around the state, around Connecticut. And NAMI was so impressed that they hired a peer to coordinate the program. And
nationally, you mean?
Or
locally?
In Connecticut. And I won an award as the Stigma Buster of the Year that year.
Stigma Buster. Comes back to that theme. That's
so
great.
What I did was I saw this program in Connecticut working, so I adapted it for Brazilian culture, and I called it the Comunidade de Fala, which means speaking up community. And then in 2015, I went down there and trained 2 teams of people in Sao Paulo and Santa Maria, which is a city in the far south of Brazil, near the Uruguayan border. It's kind of gaucho country, different segments. Brazil is such a large country that there are different regions with different subcultures. Well, Sao Paulo, people really liked it. They did a lot of then the next year I went to Rio and I trained a new group of people. A couple years later I went to Salvador Bahia, trained a new group. And then most recently in 2024, my assistant and I trained a new group of people, a 5th group, in a 5th city, Florianópolis, which is in the Sao Paulo state of Brazil. And so these programs were really successful. They gave them to medical students and nursing students, and the students said, you know, we really like to see the practical experience of these people, because in our books we only study theory. This gives us a much greater sense of what a person like living with a mental illness, you know. And so it was a chance for the groups to come together, because as you know, once people are diagnosed, oftentimes their lives get completely chaotic. They have to lose their jobs, they lose their education, their friends, sometimes the families abandon them, and they're all alone with nothing to do. Their lives have stopped. And so this program gives them a narrative to talk about their lives, from the time, the difficult days, to when they accept their illness, to their treatment of medication and therapy and peer support, and then how they cope with their illness. After each segment, they stop and let the audience ask questions and make comments.
So I want to interject a question, because you know, this is such a positive presentation and such a kind of a glowing review of your own recovery.
4 minutes left.
Okay. Well, so just very quickly, I did have an opportunity to talk to somebody at my workplace today who's a supervisor and a clinician in behavioral health, and he said, you know, relapse can be part of the journey.
Sure.
And so I'm not asking you to speak about that for yourself necessarily, but I think we need to acknowledge that it's not all one directional necessarily.
It's not all one direction. In fact, it's like a snail moving. It's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. It's like that.
I think it's important to acknowledge
that. The thing is that not only did people feel part of a group and belong to a group, but they had a new mission in life. And some of the people went back to school. One fellow in Sao Paulo has gotten a master's in psychology. Now he's going for his PhD. 4 of the people in the program have actually written books about their illness and recovery. One fellow wrote a play about it. This fellow is interesting. He said, now he can go to any bar in Sao Paulo, he can order a beer, and if somebody asks him what he does, he says, I'm a lecturer in mental health. You know, so he's overcome the stigma. He's free to do things and not fear being rejected or excluded. Anyway, these kinds of experiences went way beyond my expectation of how things would help people. But all these people have gone ahead in their lives many times beyond mental illness into other programs. There's a woman in Salvador who's now a candidate for city council. Another woman there is now an actress and plays in movies in her city.
Wow.
So the program has really proven itself. You know,
Congratulations to you on that.
Well,
for,
thank you.
for
Thank you.
helping many lives.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And you know, I'm very proud of what's happened to these programs and the kinds of things people have gone on to do. And I'm actually in the process now of turning over the leadership of the program to supervisors in each city to take it over for me. And I'm now also writing a memoir of my adventures in Brazil and the Peace Corps as a news correspondent, and then with the mental health field. So I'm really active doing that now too. We've got 2 minutes left. Okay, would you care to make any kind of comment? Or?
Well, as I thought about this program, when you initially talked to me about being part of it, I thought this really is about lemons to lemonade, and then you wound up using that as the title totally coincidentally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one thing that this gentleman at work said today, which I'm looking at, I want to quote specifically. He said, "We can't work harder than the client is willing to." And I hear from your story, Richard, that when you were able to muster the energy and kind of get back on your feet, you have worked really hard. And
it's been another profession for me, but it's a delight. It's something that I love doing. I find a great deal of purpose and satisfaction in this kind of work. And I want to thank you so much for being on the show tonight and for sharing your experiences with the Southwest Community Health Program there in Bridgeport. I want to thank our viewers for tuning in tonight. I hope you saw how I was able to take advantage of my illness and recovery to get a career out of myself. But a lot of people are in recovery. In fact, most people are in recovery, and each person does recovery in his own way. So that some people, become counselors, other people become parents. There are lots of things people can do once they're feeling better.
No cookie cutter here.
There's no cookie cutter approach. Exactly.
Yeah.
So really, thanks so much for being with the show tonight. I really appreciate it.
Well,
I hope the viewers
for inviting me.
have enjoyed it as much as I have. And that's going to be it for tonight. Thank you so much, everyone. Okay, Vic, you can roll the music, please.
We're done.
There we go.
Okay.